The bullet tore through the elk's heart just as the sun crested the ridge, and Kieran Hawthorne knew he had work to do before the autumn cold could stiffen the meat. He was a mountain man through and through, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle, earned from years of surviving in the Ozark wilderness, his dark hair falling past his collar in waves that caught the morning light. The year was 1867, and he had been living alone in these Arkansas mountains for the better part of 5 years, ever since the war had ended, and he found he could not stomach the crowded settlements anymore. His cabin sat nestled in a valley 3 miles from Bentonville, close enough to trade his furs and meat, but far enough that he could breathe without feeling walls closing in around him. The elk was a massive bull, easily 600 pounds, and Kieran worked quickly to field dress it, his knife moving with practiced precision through hide and muscle. He would need to make 2 trips to get all the meat back to his cabin, but the hide was worth the effort. It was thick and prime, perfect for tanning, and as he worked his hands over the still warm body, he thought about the coming winter. It would be a hard one. He could feel it in his bones, and he needed to prepare. By the time he hauled the last of the meat back to his cabin, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. His arms ached pleasantly from the work, muscles flexing beneath his homespun shirt as he hung the meat in his smokehouse. The hide he stretched carefully on a frame he had built years ago, beginning the long process of scraping away the flesh and fat. It would take weeks to tan properly, but Kieran had patience. The mountains had taught him that. He was working by lantern light that evening, the golden glow illuminating his weathered face as he carefully scraped the hide, when he heard the sound of a horse approaching. Kieran stilled immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against the cabin wall. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome, but as the rider came into view, he saw it was Doc Morrison from Bentonville, and the old man looked troubled. "Kieran," the doctor called out, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested such activities. "I need your help." Kieran set down his scraping tool and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "What is it?" "Got a situation in town. Young woman came in on the stage 3 days ago, supposed to be meeting her intended. Turned out the man died 2 months back, and nobody thought to write her. She has no money to get back east, no family here, and winter is coming on." Doc Morrison shook his head. "The boarding house cannot keep her past next week. Mrs. Henderson is already stretched thin." "What do you want from me?" Kieran asked, though he suspected he already knew. "You need help. Your place is big enough for 2, and you could use someone to help with the daily work so you can focus on your hunting and trapping. She is a good girl, Kieran, educated. Her name is Rebecca Emerson, and she does not deserve to starve, or worse, because some fool could not manage to post a letter." Kieran turned back to his hide, running his fingers over the surface to check for spots he had missed. "I live alone for a reason, Doc." "I know. But this is different. She needs help, and whether you want to admit it or not, so do you. At least, come to town tomorrow and meet her. If you do not think it will work, fine, but give her a chance." The doctor left soon after, and Kieran returned to his work, trying to push the conversation from his mind. But as he worked the hide under the lantern light, scraping and smoothing, he found his thoughts drifting. He had been alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it was like to have another person nearby, to hear a voice that was not his own echo off the cabin walls. The war had taken something from him, some ability to connect with people the way he once had. But maybe the doctor was right. Maybe it was time to try. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Kieran saddled his bay gelding and made the ride into Bentonville, the town coming into view as he descended from the higher elevations. It was a modest settlement, growing steadily as more people moved west after the war, but still small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. He tied his horse outside the boarding house and paused before going inside, suddenly uncertain in a way he had not been in years. Mrs. Henderson greeted him at the door, her round face breaking into a smile. "Kieran Hawthorne, Doc Morrison said you might come. She's in the parlor." Rebecca Emerson sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, and when she turned to look at him, Kieran felt something shift in his chest. She was young, probably not more than 22 or 23, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes the color of spring moss. But it was not her beauty that struck him, though she was undeniably lovely. It was the way she held herself, straight-backed and dignified, despite the obvious fear in her eyes, the set of her jaw that spoke of determination, even in the face of disaster. "Miss Emerson," he said, removing his hat, "I am Kieran Hawthorne." "Mr. Hawthorne?" Her voice was soft but steady, with the cultured accent of someone educated back east. "Dr. Morrison said you might be willing to help me." They talked for over an hour, and Kieran found himself explaining his life in the mountains, the work that needed doing, the isolation, and the hardships. Rebecca listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions, and when he finished, she met his gaze directly. "I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Hawthorne. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania before my father died, and my mother moved us to Philadelphia. I know how to cook and clean and sew. I can learn whatever else you need me to know. All I ask is a safe place to stay and enough to eat. I will earn my keep, I promise you that." There was something in her voice, a quiet desperation that she tried to hide, that made Kieran's decision for him. "All right, you can come stay at my cabin. We will figure out the rest as we go." The relief that flooded her face was almost painful to see, and Kieran wondered what kind of man her intended had been, to bring her all this way and then die without anyone bothering to tell her. They made arrangements for him to collect her the following morning, and as Kieran rode back to his cabin, he wondered if he had just made the best decision of his life, or the worst. Rebecca arrived with a single trunk and a carpet bag, all her worldly possessions packed into those 2 containers. Kieran loaded them into his wagon and helped her up onto the seat, noting how thin her traveling cloak was. It would not be enough for an Ozark winter, not by half. The ride to his cabin took the better part of 2 hours, following rough trails that wound through dense forest and across cold running streams. Rebecca said little, but her eyes took in everything, and Kieran found himself seeing his home territory through fresh eyes. The way the sunlight filtered through the oak and hickory trees, painting patterns on the forest floor. The distant call of a hawk circling overhead, the clean smell of pine and earth. When they reached the cabin, Rebecca climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help, and Kieran appreciated that. She was not some delicate flower expecting to be coddled. She walked around the cabin slowly, taking in the solid log construction, the stone chimney, the small barn where he kept his horse, and the chickens he had managed to acquire over the years. "It is a good place," she said finally. "Solid, well built. My father was a carpenter," Kieran said, "before the war. He taught me how to work with wood." He showed her inside, suddenly aware of how rough everything was. The furniture he had built himself, functional but plain. The single room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with the bedroom partitioned off by a curtain. The loft above where he had been sleeping since he built the place. "You can have the bedroom," he said. "I will stay in the loft." Rebecca turned to him, her expression serious. "Mr. Hawthorne, I want to be clear about something. I am grateful for your help, more grateful than I can say. But I need you to understand that I am here to work, nothing more. I will not be anyone's mistress or plaything." Kieran felt his face heat, though whether from anger or embarrassment he was not sure. "I did not ask you here for that, Miss Emerson. You will have your privacy, and I will have mine. We are strangers helping each other, nothing more." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we understand each other." They settled into an awkward routine over the next few days. Rebecca proved to be as capable as she had promised, taking over the cooking and cleaning without complaint. She was a better cook than Kieran by far, able to make something delicious out of the simple ingredients he had on hand. She organized his cluttered cabin, finding places for everything, and somehow making the space feel more like a home than it had in years. Kieran spent his days hunting and working on the elk hide, which was progressing well. He had brains saved from previous hunts, and he worked them into the hide to soften it, a process that took strength and patience. Sometimes he would catch Rebecca watching him work, her eyes following the movements of his hands, and he found himself wondering what she was thinking. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Rebecca told him about her life in Philadelphia, how she had been working as a seamstress when she met Thomas Whitmore through a correspondence arranged by a mutual acquaintance. He had seemed kind in his letters, promising her a new life in Arkansas, and she had believed him. She did not cry when she spoke of it, but Kieran could hear the hurt beneath her words. He told her about the war, though less than he might have. About coming home to find his parents dead of fever, his sisters married and moved away. About the restlessness that had driven him into the mountains, the need for space and silence after years of cannon fire and screaming. "Do you ever get lonely?" Rebecca asked one night, her face illuminated by the firelight. Kieran considered the question. "Sometimes, but lonely is better than trapped." "I understand that," she said softly. "I felt trapped in Philadelphia. Everything was so crowded, so noisy. People everywhere, all the time. I thought coming west would be an adventure." "It still can be," Kieran said, "just a different kind than you expected." As October gave way to November, the weather turned colder, and Kieran watched Rebecca shiver in her thin cloak with growing concern. The elk hide was nearly finished, soft and supple from his careful tanning, and one night after Rebecca had gone to bed, he sat by the lantern light and began to cut. He had never made a coat before, but he had watched his mother sew often enough as a boy, and his hands were steady from years of precise knife work. He worked late into the night, cutting the hide into panels, using an awl to punch holes for the sinew he would use as thread. The coat took shape slowly, and he found himself thinking about Rebecca as he worked, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the determined set of her shoulders when she tackled a difficult task. She had been with him for nearly a month now, and he could not imagine the cabin without her anymore. Rebecca found him asleep at the table one morning, the partially finished coat spread out before him, and when he woke, her hand was on his shoulder, her face close to his. "Kieran," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name. "What is this?" He sat up, rolling his stiff shoulders. "A coat. For you. Your cloak is not warm enough for winter here." Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned away quickly, but not before he saw them. "You do not have to do this." "I know," he said. "I want to." She was quiet for a moment, then she turned back to him, and the expression on her face made his breath catch. "Let me help. I can sew better than you can, and it will go faster with two of us working on it." They spent the next week working on the coat together, Rebecca's skilled hands stitching where his were clumsy, both of them hunched over the work by lantern light each evening. It became their project, their shared creation, and Kieran found himself sitting closer to her than strictly necessary, drawn by her warmth and the quiet concentration on her face. One night their hands touched as they both reached for the sinew at the same time, and neither of them pulled away. Kieran looked up and found Rebecca watching him, her green eyes dark in the lantern light. "I was afraid when I came here," she said quietly. "Afraid of being alone with a man I did not know, afraid of what you might expect from me. But you have been nothing but kind. You have given me safety and shelter and asked for nothing in return." "You have given me plenty," Kieran said, his voice rough. "You have given me company, conversation. You have made this cabin feel like a home again." "Kieran," she said, and then she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative, giving him every chance to pull away. He did not pull away. Instead, he cupped her face with his calloused hands and kissed her back, feeling something in his chest break open, some wall he had built around his heart crumbling to dust. When they finally separated, both of them were breathing hard, and Rebecca's cheeks were flushed pink. "I did not plan that," she said, sounding stunned. "I am glad you did it anyway," Kieran replied, and she laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the quiet cabin. They finished the coat 2 days later, and when Rebecca put it on for the first time, Kieran felt a surge of pride so intense it almost hurt. The elk hide had tanned to a rich golden brown, soft as butter against her skin, and the coat fit her perfectly, falling to mid-calf and cinching at the waist. Rebecca turned in a circle, the coat swirling around her legs, and the smile on her face was radiant. "It is beautiful," she said, "the most beautiful thing I have ever owned." "It suits you," Kieran said, and then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, until they were both dizzy with it. They did not rush things, both of them aware that what was building between them was too precious to hurry. But as the first snow began to fall in late November, they came together finally and completely, and Kieran learned that Rebecca had as much passion beneath her quiet exterior as he had suspected. She was fierce and tender by turns, giving herself to him with a trust that humbled him. Afterwards, lying tangled together in his bed, Rebecca traced the scars on his chest, remnants of the war he had tried to leave behind. "Tell me about them," she said softly. So he did, the words coming easier than they ever had before. He told her about the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, the things he had seen that still woke him in the night sometimes. And Rebecca listened, her hand over his heart, and when he finished, she kissed each scar gently, as if she could heal them with her touch. "You are the strongest man I've ever known," she said. "Not because of your muscles or your skill with a rifle, but because you survived all of that and still have kindness left in you." Winter settled over the Ozarks in earnest, and Rebecca wore the coat Kieran had made her every day, whether she was feeding the chickens or walking to the stream for water or simply standing outside to watch the snow fall. Kieran would catch her running her hands over the soft hide, a small smile on her face, and each time he saw her in it, he felt that same surge of pride and something deeper, something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. They were snowed in for 3 weeks in January, the drifts piling high against the cabin walls, but neither of them minded. They had plenty of food stored up, and the cabin was warm. They spent the days talking and working side by side, Rebecca teaching Kieran how to make better bread while he taught her how to tan smaller hides for gloves and moccasins. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Kieran would read aloud from the few books he owned while Rebecca sewed or mended their clothes. One night, after they had made love and were lying together in the darkness, Rebecca said, "I want to stay here, not just for the winter, but always, if you will have me." Kieran pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "I cannot imagine letting you go, but are you sure? This life is hard, Rebecca, isolated. You would be giving up any chance at the kind of life you might have had back east." "I do not want that life," she said firmly. "I want this one, with you. I love you, Kieran. I think I have loved you since the day I watched you work on that hide by lantern light, so careful and patient, creating something beautiful." "I love you too," he said, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly natural. "I did not think I could anymore after the war, but you changed that. You changed everything." When the snow finally melted enough for them to make the trip into Bentonville, they went to see Doc Morrison first. The old man took one look at them standing together, Rebecca wearing the magnificent elk hide coat, and he grinned. "I see my matchmaking worked out well," he said. "We want to get married," Kieran said, his hand firm in Rebecca's, "as soon as possible." The doctor arranged for the minister to perform the ceremony the next day, and they stood in the small church with Doc Morrison and Mrs. Henderson as witnesses and pledged their lives to each other. Rebecca wore her elk hide coat over her best dress, and Kieran wore his cleanest shirt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was full of promise and hope. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson insisting they have some privacy and comfort, but both of them were eager to return to their cabin in the mountains. It was their home now, the place where they had found each other, and it called to them. Spring came slowly to the Ozarks, the snow melting to reveal the first green shoots of new growth. Rebecca hung the elk hide coat carefully in the cabin, no longer needed now that the weather was warming, but neither of them could bear to pack it away completely. It had become a symbol of their love, of the way Kieran had cared for her even before either of them had acknowledged their feelings. They planted a garden together, Rebecca directing while Kieran did the heavy digging, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt in a way that made her pause to watch more often than not. He would catch her looking and grin, pulling her into his arms for a kiss that usually led to them abandoning work for the afternoon. In May, Rebecca realized she was pregnant, and the joy on Kieran's face when she told him brought tears to her eyes. He became even more protective than before, insisting on doing the heavier chores himself, making sure she had plenty to eat and enough rest. Sometimes she would scold him for fussing, but mostly she loved it, loved being cared for so thoroughly. "I am not made of glass," she said one afternoon, laughing as Kieran insisted on carrying the basket of wet laundry for her. "I know," he said, setting the basket down and pulling her close, "but you are carrying the most precious thing in the world to me, and I will not take any chances." Their son was born in January of 1868, during a cold snap that made even Kieran nervous, but Rebecca was strong, and the baby came into the world howling his displeasure at the temperature. They named him Daniel, after Kieran's father, and Kieran held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one calloused finger. "You are perfect. I cannot believe you have given me this." Rebecca, exhausted but radiant, smiled up at him. We made him together. We made this whole life together. That winter was the happiest of Kieran's life, though it was also one of the hardest. The baby needed constant attention, waking every few hours to nurse, and Rebecca was tired in a way she had never been before. But Kieran took over every other task he could, cooking and cleaning and doing the laundry, staying up to walk with Daniel when he was fussy so Rebecca could sleep. One night, he stood by the window with his son in his arms, watching the snow fall, and thought about how much his life had changed. 2 years ago, he had been alone, existing more than living, going through the motions of survival without any real joy. Now he had a wife he loved more than his own life, and a son who depended on him for everything. He had purpose again, meaning, and it was better than anything he had imagined. As spring returned, they fell into a new rhythm, one that included a baby who was growing bigger every day. Daniel was a happy child, quick to smile, and he seemed to love the mountain air as much as his parents did. Rebecca would carry him in a sling Kieran had made, going about her daily tasks with practiced ease, and Kieran would come home from hunting to find his wife and son waiting for him, the cabin warm and welcoming. One afternoon in early summer, Rebecca brought out the elk hide coat and held it up, examining it critically. "What is it?" Kieran asked, watching her. "It is getting too warm to wear, but I hate to put it away. It means too much." She ran her fingers over the soft hide, remembering that first winter, the way Kieran had worked by lantern light to create something just for her. "Then hang it where we can see it," Kieran suggested, "a reminder of where we started." They hung the coat on a peg by the door, and it stayed there, a constant presence in their home. Visitors, when they had them, would often comment on it, admiring the craftsmanship and the quality of the hide. But Kieran and Rebecca would just smile at each other, knowing the coat meant so much more than anyone else could understand. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Daniel grew into a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, fearless and curious about everything. Kieran taught him about the forest, how to track animals and read the weather and respect the land that provided for them. Rebecca taught him his letters and numbers, determined that her son would be educated even living as remotely as they did. In the winter of 1870, Rebecca gave birth to twin daughters, Emma and Sarah, and the cabin was suddenly full of noise and chaos and so much love it felt like it might burst. Kieran built an addition onto the cabin, adding 2 more bedrooms so everyone could have space, and Rebecca sewed clothes late into the night, trying to keep up with how fast the children grew. The elk hide coat became part of family legend. Rebecca wore it every winter, and each time she put it on, Kieran would remember that first year, the way they had fallen in love while stitching the panels together by lantern light. Daniel loved the story of how his father had hunted the elk and tanned the hide himself, working for weeks to create the perfect gift for his mother. "Tell us again," Emma would beg, sitting at Rebecca's feet while her mother wore the coat, and the winter wind howled outside. "Your father shot the elk just at sunrise," Rebecca would begin, her voice warm with memory. "He brought it home and began the process of tanning the hide, working every evening by lantern light. He was so careful, so patient, making sure every inch was perfect. And then he began to cut and sew, creating this coat just for me." "Because he loved you," Sarah would add, having heard the story dozens of times. "Because he loved me," Rebecca would agree, meeting Kieran's eyes across the cabin, though we had not admitted it to ourselves yet. "I think I knew from the first day," Kieran said. "I just was not ready to believe it." In the spring of 1872, tragedy struck when a late snow caught Kieran far from home during a hunting trip. He had taken shelter in a cave, but the cold had gotten into his lungs, and by the time he made it back to the cabin, he was burning with fever. Rebecca nursed him through the worst of it, her face set with determination, refusing to let him see how frightened she was. Daniel, now 4 years old, helped by keeping his sisters quiet and out of the way, and when Kieran finally opened his eyes after 3 days of fever dreams, the first thing he saw was Rebecca's face, hollow-eyed with exhaustion, but smiling. "You scared me," she said, her voice breaking. "I am sorry," he whispered, his throat raw. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise." It took weeks for him to fully recover, and during that time, he had to let Rebecca take over much of the work he normally did. It galled him, lying in bed while his wife split firewood and hauled water, but she was adamant that he rest until he was truly healed. "You have taken care of me for years," she said when he tried to argue. "Let me take care of you now." When summer came and Kieran was finally back to full strength, he took Rebecca on a trip, just the two of them, leaving the children with Mrs. Henderson in town for 3 days. They rode deep into the mountains to a spot Kieran had discovered years ago, a hidden valley with a waterfall and wildflowers growing thick across the meadow. "I wanted to show you this," he said, helping Rebecca down from her horse. "I found it the summer before I met you, and I thought it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. But it is even more beautiful with you here." They spent 3 days there, swimming in the cold creek and making love under the stars and talking about their dreams for the future. Rebecca told him she wanted to expand the garden, maybe start keeping bees for honey. Kieran talked about building a better barn, getting a milk cow so the children could have fresh milk and butter. "I want to grow old with you here," Rebecca said on their last night, lying in Kieran's arms beneath a blanket of stars. "I want to watch our children grow up and have children of their own. I want to wear that elk hide coat every winter until I am too old to walk, and I want to remember how we started every single day." "We will," Kieran promised, kissing her forehead. "All of that and more." They returned home to find their children healthy and happy, Daniel proud of how well he had behaved for Mrs. Henderson, and the twins bubbling over with stories about their adventures in town. The cabin felt even more like home after their time away, and Kieran and Rebecca fell back into their routine with renewed appreciation for what they had built together. As the years continued to pass, the elk hide coat showed signs of wear, the edges of the sleeves rubbing thin from use. But Rebecca treated it like the treasure it was, carefully mending any tears and conditioning the leather to keep it supple. Kieran would sometimes run his hands over it, remembering the hours he had spent tanning that hide, the way his muscles had ached from the work, the vision he had held in his mind of Rebecca wearing it. Daniel grew tall and strong like his father, and by the time he was 12, he was accompanying Kieran on hunting trips, learning the skills that would let him survive in the mountains. The twins were inseparable, always together, both of them inheriting their mother's skill with a needle and their father's love of the outdoors. In 1876, the family took a trip to the growing town of Bentonville for the 4th of July celebration, a rare outing for all of them. Rebecca wore a new dress she had made, but she brought the elk hide coat along because Kieran insisted, even though it was the height of summer. "You never know when you might want it," he said, grinning at her exasperated expression. At the celebration, people marveled at the coat when Rebecca showed it to them, the quality of the tanning and the expert construction drawing admiration from even the best seamstresses in town. But when someone offered to buy it, offering what seemed like a fortune to the children, Rebecca just laughed. "This coat is not for sale," she said firmly, "not for any amount of money. It is worth more than that to me." On the ride home, with the children asleep in the back of the wagon, Kieran reached over and took Rebecca's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For understanding. For knowing that some things cannot be bought or sold because they mean too much." Rebecca squeezed his hand, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I would never sell it. That coat represents the moment I knew I was home, really home, for the first time in my life, the moment I knew I was loved completely and unconditionally." By 1880, Daniel was 14 and starting to think about his own future. He loved the mountains as much as his father, but he also had a curiosity about the wider world that Kieran recognized and tried to encourage. The twins were 9, still children, but growing more independent every day. That winter was particularly harsh, the snow falling earlier and heavier than anyone could remember. Rebecca wore the elk hide coat constantly, grateful for its warmth as she went about her daily tasks. The coat was 11 years old now, well worn but still beautiful, still serviceable, a testament to the quality of Kieran's work all those years ago. One night, as they all sat around the fire, Daniel asked his father to tell the story of how he had hunted the elk and made the coat. It was a story they had all heard many times, but it never got old. Kieran settled back in his chair, Rebecca at his side wearing the famous coat, and began. It was October of 1867, and I had been living alone in these mountains for 5 years. I saw the elk just at sunrise, a massive bull with a hide that looked like it had been touched by gold in the early light. He told the whole story, from the hunt to the tanning process to the long nights spent cutting and stitching by lantern light. He talked about how nervous he had been to meet Rebecca, how her courage had impressed him, how they had worked on the coat together and fallen in love in the process. "Your mother wore this coat all through that first winter," he said, reaching over to touch the soft hide. "And every time I saw her in it, I felt like the luckiest man alive. I still do." Rebecca's eyes were bright with tears, and the children were silent, caught up in the romance of their parents' story. Later, after the children were in bed, Rebecca came to Kieran and kissed him with all the passion of that first winter. "I love you," she said, "just as much now as I did then. More even." "More," Kieran agreed, pulling her close. "Always more." In 1882, Daniel left home to attend school in Little Rock, determined to get an education that would let him help other people. Kieran and Rebecca were proud of him, even though the cabin felt emptier without his presence. The twins stepped up to help more, taking over many of Daniel's former chores, and life continued in its steady rhythm. Rebecca was 37 that year, still beautiful, her auburn hair now streaked with silver. The elk hide coat was 14 years old, and she had mended it so many times that Kieran joked it was more sinew than original hide at this point. But it still fit her perfectly, still kept her warm, and she wore it with the same pride she had that first winter. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Rebecca turned to Kieran and said, "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me, taking on a wife and family when you had been alone for so long?" Kieran looked at her in astonishment. "Never, not once. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Rebecca. You and our children. You gave me back my life. You gave me mine," she said softly. "I was lost when I came to Arkansas, adrift and alone. You gave me a home and a purpose and love beyond anything I had imagined possible." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire, and Kieran thought about how much had changed since that first winter. How much they had built together, not just the additions to the cabin or the expanded garden, but a whole life full of meaning and joy. The twins grew into young women, both of them beautiful and capable, skilled at both domestic work and outdoor tasks. Emma had her father's practical nature, while Sarah had her mother's creative spirit, and together they made a formidable team. They had suitors coming around by the time they were 17, young men from town drawn by their reputation for beauty and competence, but the twins were in no hurry to leave home. Daniel returned from school in 1885, now a young man of 19 with plans to become a teacher. He had loved the city, but he loved the mountains more, and he wanted to bring education to the remote communities scattered through the Ozarks. Kieran could not have been prouder. That winter, Daniel brought a young woman home to meet his parents, a sweet-faced girl named Margaret, who was also studying to be a teacher. Rebecca brought out the elk hide coat for the occasion, wanting to look her best, and Margaret was captivated by the story behind it. "That's the most romantic thing I have ever heard," she said, looking between Kieran and Rebecca with shining eyes. "To make something so beautiful for someone you loved." "It was not just the coat," Kieran said, his arm around Rebecca's shoulders. "It was what it represented. Taking care of each other, building something together, creating beauty and warmth even in the hardest times." Daniel and Margaret married the following summer, and a year later they gave Kieran and Rebecca their first grandchild, a daughter they named Rebecca after her grandmother. When they brought the baby to visit, Rebecca wore the elk hide coat despite the mild weather, wanting her namesake's first memory of her to include the famous garment. The twins married within a year of each other, Emma to a blacksmith from Bentonville and Sarah to a rancher from just outside of town. Neither of them moved far, both of them wanting to stay close to their parents and the mountains they loved. Kieran and Rebecca found themselves with an expanding brood of grandchildren, the cabin often full of noise and laughter as the family gathered for Sunday dinners and holidays. Through all of this, through all the changes and growth, the elk hide coat remained constant. Rebecca wore it every winter without fail, and it became a symbol not just of Kieran's love for her, but of their whole life together. When the grandchildren asked about it, Rebecca would tell them the story, her voice warm with memory, and Kieran would add details she forgot, the two of them finishing each other's sentences in the way of couples who had been together for decades. In 1892, on their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Daniel and his wife were there, with their 3 children now. Emma had 4 children, and Sarah had 2, with another on the way. The cabin was bursting with people, 3 generations gathered together, and Kieran stood back and watched them all with a sense of overwhelming gratitude. Rebecca found him standing alone and slipped her hand into his. She was wearing the elk hide coat, as she always did for special occasions, and at 52 years old, she was even more beautiful to him than she had been at 22. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking about that elk," Kieran said, smiling. "About how I had no idea when I pulled that trigger that I was setting in motion everything that came after. That hide became this coat, and this coat brought us together, and now look at what we have created." Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder. "We have been blessed." "More than blessed," Kieran agreed. "We have been given a miracle." That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Kieran and Rebecca sat by the fire alone, as they had so many thousands of nights before. The elk hide coat hung on its peg by the door, and Kieran got up to run his hands over it, feeling the softness of the leather, the careful stitches that had held it together for 25 years. "Do you remember the night I started cutting the hide?" he asked. "I remember finding you asleep at the table the next morning," Rebecca said, smiling. "I remember being so stunned that you would do something like that for me when we barely knew each other." "I knew enough," Kieran said. "I knew you were special. I knew I wanted to keep you warm and safe." "You have done that and so much more," Rebecca said, joining him by the door. "You have given me a life I could never have imagined. Every time I put this coat on, I remember that first winter, the way we were just beginning to discover each other, the way you would work by lantern light, so careful and patient, the way we stitched it together and fell in love in the process." Kieran pulled her into his arms, the coat pressed between them. "I would do it all again, every moment, every day. You are my heart, Rebecca. You always have been." They stood there together, holding each other close, the coat that had started everything a tangible reminder of their journey. Outside, the winter wind howled, but inside the cabin was warm and safe, full of the life they had built together. As the 1890s progressed, Kieran began to slow down. He was in his 50s now, and the years of hard physical labor were taking their toll. He could not hunt the way he once had, could not work from dawn to dusk without feeling it the next day. But he was content with this stage of life, happy to spend more time at home with Rebecca, teaching his grandchildren the skills he had once taught his own children. Rebecca's hair was completely silver now, and she moved more slowly than she once had, but she was still strong and capable. She still wore the elk hide coat every winter, though it was showing its age, the leather thin in places, the sinew stitches carefully replaced multiple times over the years. She had offered more than once to retire it, to hang it up for good and preserve what was left, but Kieran always protested. "I made it to be worn," he said, "to keep you warm. That is what it should do until it cannot anymore." So Rebecca continued to wear it, and the coat continued to serve its purpose, wrapping her in warmth and love every winter day. In 1897, Kieran had a spell with his heart that frightened everyone. He recovered, but it was a stark reminder that their time was not infinite. After that, he and Rebecca made an effort to tell their children and grandchildren more stories, to pass down the history of their life together so it would not be lost. The story of the elk hide coat was told and retold, becoming part of family mythology. The grandchildren would beg to hear it, and Rebecca would oblige, her voice soft with memory as she recounted those early days. Kieran would sit beside her, adding details, and the love between them was so palpable that even the youngest children could feel it. "Tell us about the first time Papa kissed you," young Rebecca, now 12, would ask. "We were sitting at this very table working on the coat," Rebecca would say, gesturing to the heavy wooden table Kieran had built. "Our hands touched and we looked at each other, and I just knew. I knew he was the man I was meant to be with. So I kissed him, even though it was terribly forward of me." "I am glad you did," Kieran would say, taking her hand. "I might have been too much of a coward to do it first." "You were never a coward," Rebecca would say firmly. "You were just being respectful. But I did not want respect right then. I wanted you to kiss me, so I took matters into my own hands." The grandchildren would giggle, delighted by their grandmother's boldness, and Kieran would lean over and kiss her again, proving that the passion between them had not dimmed with time. In the winter of 1899, as the century drew to a close, Rebecca wore the elk hide coat to town for what would be the last time. She was visiting Emma, who had just given birth to her 8th child, and she wanted to help with the new baby and the other children. Kieran stayed home, not feeling up to the trip, and Rebecca kissed him goodbye with more intensity than usual. "I will be back in 3 days," she promised. "Do not do anything foolish while I'm gone." "I will be right here when you return," he said, holding her close. "I love you, Rebecca." "I love you too," she said, "more than anything in this world." She was as good as her word, returning 3 days later with stories of the new baby and Emma's household. Kieran met her at the door and pulled her into his arms, coat and all, and held her for a long moment. "I missed you," he said. "I was only gone 3 days, she said, laughing. "That is 3 days too long," he replied. That winter, they celebrated the new century together, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Kieran was 62 now, Rebecca 57, and they had been married for 32 years. The elk-hide coat was 32 years old too, and it had held up remarkably well, a testament to Kieran's skill and Rebecca's careful maintenance. At midnight on January 1st, 1900, as fireworks lit up the sky over Bentonville visible from their mountain cabin, Kieran took Rebecca's hand. "Another century," he said. "Who would have thought we would live to see it?" "I hope we see much more of it," Rebecca said. "Together." "Together," Kieran agreed. "Always together." The new century brought changes. More people were moving into the Ozarks, and the isolation that Kieran and Rebecca had once cherished was becoming harder to maintain. But they were content with their life, with their family that had grown so large and loving, with the home they had built together in the mountains. In the spring of 1902, Kieran suffered another heart spell, this one more serious than the last. Rebecca sent for Daniel immediately, and the whole family gathered, afraid this might be the end. But Kieran was too stubborn to die just yet, and after a few weeks he rallied enough to sit outside in the sunshine, Rebecca at his side. "I am not ready," he told her. "I have more time with you to claim." "Then you will have it," Rebecca said firmly, as if she could will him to health through sheer determination. And somehow he did recover, though he was weaker than before. He could not do much physical work anymore, but he could sit in his rocking chair and watch Rebecca move about the cabin, and that was enough. He could hold his great-grandchildren, now starting to arrive, and tell them stories of the old days. He could watch the sun set over the mountains he loved and know that his life had been well lived. The elk-hide coat was 35 years old now, and Rebecca wore it less often, worried about wearing it out completely. But on special occasions, she would take it down from its peg and put it on, and Kieran's face would light up every time. "You are as beautiful now as you were the first time you wore that," he said one winter evening, watching her button the coat. "You're a terrible liar," Rebecca said, but she was smiling. "But I love you for saying it." "It is not a lie," Kieran insisted. "You are even more beautiful now because I know you so well. I know every story written on your face, every laugh line and worry crease. You are my whole world, Rebecca." She came to sit beside him, taking his weathered hand in hers. "And you are mine. You saved me, Kieran. When I came to Arkansas, I was lost and afraid, and you gave me a home and a purpose and a love that has sustained me through everything." "We saved each other," Kieran said. "I was just existing before you came. You gave me back my life, my heart. Everything good in my life started the day I agreed to meet you." They sat together in comfortable silence, the coat soft and warm around Rebecca's shoulders, and watched the snow fall outside the window. They had seen so many snowfalls together, so many winters, but each one was still precious, still beautiful. In 1905, at the age of 68, Kieran knew his time was growing short. His heart was failing, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. He accepted this with the same stoic calm he had faced everything in his life, but there was one thing he needed to do first. He called the family together, all of them crowding into the cabin that had been expanded multiple times over the years, but still felt too small for such a gathering. Rebecca sat beside him, wearing the elk-hide coat even though it was summer, understanding that this was important. "I want to tell you all something," Kieran said, his voice weaker than it had been, but still clear. "This coat that your mother is wearing, I made it for her 38 years ago before we were married. I tanned that elk hide myself, working every evening by lantern light, and then I cut it and stitched it into this coat. I did it because I loved her, even though I had not admitted it to myself yet, even though we barely knew each other." He paused to catch his breath, and Rebecca squeezed his hand. "That coat represents everything your mother and I have built together. It represents care and patience and dedication. It represents making something beautiful out of raw materials, creating warmth and safety through hard work. Your mother wore that coat all through our first winter together, and she has worn it every winter since. It has lasted because she has taken care of it, mended it when it needed mending, treated it with respect and love. He looked around at all the faces watching him, 3 generations of his family, and felt his heart swell with love and pride. I want you to remember this coat," he said. "I want you to remember that love is not just a feeling. It is action. It is staying up late to create something for someone else's comfort. It is careful attention over decades. It is mending what is broken and preserving what is precious. Your mother and I have had a good life together because we understood that, because we worked at our love the way I worked at tanning that hide." There were tears on many faces, and Rebecca was crying openly now, but she was smiling too. "I love you all," Kieran said, "and I love your mother more than words can express. Remember us, remember what we built together, and try to build something half as good in your own lives." He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, with Rebecca beside him wearing the elk hide coat. She held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart was breaking, there was also peace. They had had 38 years together, years full of love and laughter and hard work and joy. They had raised 3 children who had given them 15 grandchildren, and those grandchildren were beginning to have children of their own. The family they had created would go on, and their love would live on through them. The funeral was held at the cabin, with what seemed like half of Bentonville in attendance. Everyone who had known Kieran had a story to tell, and many of those stories involved Rebecca and the famous elk hide coat. People spoke of Kieran's skill as a craftsman, his kindness, his integrity, his love for his family. But it was Rebecca's words that everyone remembered. She stood beside the grave wearing the elk hide coat despite the summer heat and spoke from her heart. "Kieran was the best man I have ever known," she said, her voice steady despite her grief. "He was strong and gentle, fierce and kind, protective and supportive. He made me this coat when we barely knew each other, working by lantern light to create something that would keep me warm. And he spent the rest of his life doing the same thing in 1,000 different ways, always making sure I was safe and warm and loved." She touched the soft hide of the coat, worn thin in places from 38 years of use. "This coat is falling apart now," she said. "The leather is thin. The stitches have been replaced so many times I have lost count. But it is still beautiful to me, still precious, because Kieran made it. Because every time I put it on, I remember the man he was and the love we shared. I will wear it until it falls apart completely, and even then I will keep the pieces, because this coat is proof that love endures, that something made with care and dedication and love can last far longer than anyone expects." She was 60 years old, her hair silver, her face lined with age and grief, but to those who knew her, she had never looked more beautiful. She embodied everything Kieran had said about love being action, about creating beauty through hard work and dedication. Rebecca lived for another 12 years after Kieran's death, staying in the cabin they had shared, cared for by her children and grandchildren who refused to let her be alone. She wore the elk hide coat every winter, even as it grew more fragile, even as Daniel begged her to retire it before it fell apart completely. "Your father made this for me," she said. "I will wear it as long as I can." She spent her final years telling stories to her great-grandchildren, passing down the history of the family, making sure they knew where they came from. The story of the elk hide coat was told so many times that even the youngest children could recite it, and it became a beloved family legend. In the winter of 1917, at the age of 72, Rebecca knew her time was coming. She called her children to her and gave them each something precious. To Daniel, she gave Kieran's rifle, the one he had used to hunt that elk so many years ago. To Emma, she gave her mother's wedding ring, the one Kieran had bought with furs he had traded. To Sarah, she gave the dress she had worn on their wedding day, carefully preserved all these years. And to all of them, she gave the elk hide coat, or what was left of it. It was 50 years old now, impossibly ancient for a piece of clothing that had been worn so heavily. The leather was thin as paper in places, held together more by Rebecca's careful mending than by the original construction. But it was still recognizable, still beautiful in its way. "I want you to keep this," she told them. "Not to wear, it is too fragile for that now, but to remember. This coat represents your father's love for me and my love for him. It represents everything we built together, every winter we survived, every spring we celebrated. It represents a life well lived and a love that lasted until death and beyond." She died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep, just as Kieran had. And true to her wishes, the elk hide coat was preserved by the family, passed down through generations as a tangible reminder of a love story that had started with a mountain man tanning a hide by lantern light and creating a coat for a woman he was just beginning to love. The coat was eventually given to the Historical Society in Bentonville, where it was carefully restored and put on display. A plaque beside it told the story of Kieran and Rebecca Hawthorne, the mountain man, and the Eastern woman who had found love in the Arkansas Ozarks. It told of how he had hunted an elk and tanned its hide, working by lantern light to create a coat for her, and how she had worn that coat all through their first winter together and every winter after for 50 years. But more than that, it told the story of what love really meant, not just passion and romance, though they had plenty of that, but care and dedication and patience, hard work and attention over decades. Creating something beautiful and then maintaining it, mending it when it broke, treating it with respect and love. Generations of visitors would come to see the coat, drawn by the story. They would stand before the glass case and look at the worn leather, the careful stitches, the shape of it that suggested the woman who had worn it so faithfully. And they would understand something important about love, about how it endured, not because it was easy, but because it was chosen every day, over and over again. The story of Kieran and Rebecca Hawthorne, of the mountain man who tanned the hide and cut it by lantern light, and the woman who wore the coat he made her all winter, became legendary in that part of Arkansas. Parents told it to their children, teachers shared it in classrooms, and young couples starting their own lives together would visit the Historical Society to see the coat and be inspired by the love it represented. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the coat itself, though it was beautiful and well made, but what it symbolized. The way Kieran had seen Rebecca's need and worked to meet it, the way she had recognized his gift for what it was and treasured it accordingly. The way they had both understood that love was something you made, carefully and patiently, working by whatever light you had available, creating warmth and beauty that would last far longer than anyone might expect. The elk hide coat that Kieran Hawthorne made for Rebecca Emerson in the autumn of 1867 lasted for 50 years, an impossibly long time for such a heavily used garment. But the love it represented lasted longer still, passed down through generations, inspiring others to build their own lives with the same care and dedication that Kieran and Rebecca had shown. And in that way, though both of them had been gone for many years, their love continued to create warmth and beauty in the world, just as it had from that very first winter when a mountain man tanned a hide by lantern light and cut it into a coat for the woman who would become his whole world. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would return to the cabin in the mountains, now preserved as part of the historical site, and they would stand in the same room where Kieran had worked on that hide, where he and Rebecca had stitched the panels together and fallen in love. They would touch the table he had built, look out the window at the same mountains he had loved, and feel connected to a story that had started so simply and become something extraordinary. The legacy of Kieran and Rebecca Hawthorne was not just the coat, though that was the most visible symbol. It was the family they had created, the love they had modeled, the understanding they had passed down that real love was work, beautiful work, but work nonetheless. It was showing up every day and choosing to care for each other, to create warmth and safety even in the hardest times, to mend what was broken and preserve what was precious. And so the story ended, not with death, but with continuation, with a love that rippled outward through time, touching lives that Kieran and Rebecca could never have imagined. The mountain man and his beloved, working together by lantern light, creating something that would last long after they were gone. A coat that became a symbol, a love that became a legend, and a life that became an inspiration for all who heard their story.